What are the principal elements of the sexual revolution? Bruno, Annabelle, and Michelle are to different degrees products of families. Bruno and Michelle come from what we would call broken families, and very much an absentee mother. Annabelle is the product of an intact family, and she is pretty sheltered from the sexual revolution. Michelle is insulated because he is a loner and lived in the country. Bruno is born in 1956, Michelle in 1958, Annabelle also in the late 50s. They were all teenagers as the 1970s began. What was happening? We get a picture of Michelle swinging in the hay with his cousin Brigitte in 1967. She is wearing a mini skirt. He touched her breast. That is in section 6 of part 1. In section 9, we discover that from the moral standpoint, 1970 was marked by a substantial increase in the consumption of the erotic, despite the intervention of vigilant censors. What was out was the musical Hair, bare breasts on the Riviera, sex shops went from 3 in number to 45 in Paris. In section 10, we learn of how the distinction between love and flirtation dominated the tabloids. Rock and roll music dominated the airwaves. The self-indulgent American approach to dating, some heavy petting in the back seat and all that, became normal in October 1970, as we see in section 10. In Balanced Diet, section 12, we see France embracing the youth culture based principally on sex and violence. The events of 1974 revealed this. Laws and mores flipped to advance the cause of moral relativism. Clubs opened in Paris that played a pioneering role in the cult of the beautiful body. The age of consent was lowered to 18 in a law passed in July 1974. Divorce by mutual consent was acknowledged in law, and adultery was removed from the penal code. Abortion was legalized in November 1974. Thus, the moral system was replaced. No longer believing in a soul, the people focused on the pleasures of the body, and those pleasures were principally sexual. What did this change mean? Houellebecq tells us explicitly. This change meant that the fetus, a small collection of steadily subdividing cells, was no longer recognized as a viable individual except by consensus. On the other hand, the new concept of human dignity meant that the elderly, a collection of steadily failing organs, had the right to life only as long as they continued to function. Thus, abortion and euthanasia are battlegrounds, as they form the limits of the human. Without inherent respectability, people are respected only as they are able to choose. Thus, sexualized materialism is the reigning milieu. How do each of the kids treat it? By the end of part 1, The Lost Kingdom, we learn a lot about Bruno. Annabelle has gotten her first abortion, and Michelle has isolated himself in scientific studies. Let us now focus on Bruno. Bruno is the most exposed to this sexualized materialism. He turns 18 in 1974. Remember that Bruno is an omega male, introverted, sensitive, not taking the initiative. After being brutalized in his boarding school, Bruno has a date with Caroline Yessayan in section 10, and he calls this date the defining moment of his life. What happened? He went to a movie with her. She was hoping for a handhold, but instead Bruno put his hand on the bare thigh of Caroline. Bruno could not imagine she bore her thigh for no reason. She let his hand sit there for a moment, but then moved it away. This humiliation confirmed Bruno's subordination in the sexual hierarchy. The bad boys of the boarding school had scored with the girls. The omega male cannot even get a hand on the thigh. He had a chance, but it all ended in a terrible emptiness. Caroline seemed to be participating in a new dating system for girls between 12 and 18. This dating system is described on page 64. They were supposed to go out with boys, but no one knew exactly what that would mean. Kissing? The joys of petting? Going all the way? A touch of the breast? Hands up the knickers? Authorities gave contradictory answers to these questions, so no girl knew how to act. After this early stage, girls would pursue serious relationships, where the questions would involve whether to move in without marriage. The ambiguities here led to the high divorce rates. Nevertheless, we have accepted the girls' improbable rules and tried their best to stick with them. Bruno could not get any action in this environment. And keep this in mind when we get back to Annabelle. Bruno went to college to study the arts, where he masturbated at least 3 times a day, as we see in section 11. His career ceiling was to be a middle manager of sorts. He was weak, not especially handsome. He could attract neither with his body nor his status. He was down the scale of the hierarchy. This relationship between sexual hierarchy and neoliberal meritocracy is a theme, as we have seen. He dreamed of gaping vaginas, but the legs of the girls were closed to him, if I may quote Houellebecq again. He would stare at the women on the train on his way to visit, and he would get a hard-on the moment he saw the sweep of the long blonde or dark hair. Sometimes he would masturbate on the train. He was clearly sexually obsessed. Bruno tells the story of coming on to a little chubby girl at the end of section 12. This is where he lost his virginity, but he was on vacation. We hear the rest of Bruno's history in a flashback from section 9 of part 2, Strange Moments. So let us keep the straight line story going. Bruno watches a lot of porn. He runs into this little chubby girl, again, in Paris, and this chubby girl has now become obese. Annick, her name, is now uglier and fatter, he says. But she services him night after night. He shows her no real affection. And eventually, we see, Annick jumps out of the 7th floor window and commits suicide. Bruno, not much affected by this suicide, turns to prostitutes, sex shops, and peep shows. He has what Houellebecq calls a permanent hard-on. We learn more about Bruno in a flashback in sections 12 and 14 of part 2. We learn of his marriage to Anne and his humiliation. When it comes to his relationship with Anne, sex before marriage, check. Anne gets pregnant, check. Bruno gets a job as a teacher and starts living a middle-class bougie life, check. But then they start going to church. They try to live in the old way. They are baptized. He was, after all, a product of an older generation. But he's also a product of his generation. He starts drinking and womanizing. He gives his erect penis to one of his students. He goes into phone sex. The wife, Anne, had let herself go, it seems. And the money for the couple gets tight because of the hookers and phone sex that Bruno uses. Anne wanted, however, to be a mother and a housewife. But Bruno wanted sex and a divorce. He arranged things so that she could get a job, something she didn't want. They moved to Paris, and the divorce came as a matter of course. Next came, after the divorce, for Bruno, hair transplants and going to the gym. But it was nevertheless the same old Bruno, bureaucratic jobs and paying for sex. We see Bruno at a kind of sex, new agey commune in part 2, Strange Moments. He is 42 years old by then. The revolution had proceeded apace. So had his sexual obsessiveness. He continues to be a low-rung guy. He continues to work middling bureaucratic jobs. He is a loser in the hierarchy who has difficulty getting action at the sex commune until he meets Christiana. This will be the topic of video 5, when we survey the relationship of this new sexual order. Spoiler alert, Annick's suicide is not the last. Bruno is the pure product of the sexual revolution. He is least sheltered from it. He most imbibes its desires. He most encapsulates its sadness and limits. He gets individualism good and hard, and the result is a kind of creature who cannot live in light of tomorrow, who cannot bear responsibilities, and who lives for the most short-term goals, sexual release. One can feel a bit sorry for him in this situation. The question that Houellebecq pushes on us is this: why has this new system won so solidly, despite its effect on people? Bruno and his wife had tried to live in the old way after experiencing the new. What made that impossible? Was it something that could be recovered? And was the old way even worth recovering? These questions concern us as we move toward the next phase of the novel. But now let us turn to Michel and Annabelle and discuss how they experience life after the sexual revolution.